Hi guys, unfortunately YouTube isn't pushing my videos right now. A like from you and any comment would really help. Thanks. And now let's jump into today's story. Has it ever happened to you that the woman you share your life with, the one you trusted most, suddenly decided not only to betray your marriage, but to erase your career with a single stroke of her pen? It sounds unreal, right? Well, it happened to me. My name is Daniel Ross, I'm 39, and my wife, she was my boss. And yes, she fired me. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Because my story isn't just about a broken marriage. It's about power, betrayal, and the brutal games people play in the glass towers of New York City. For nearly 2 decades, I built my career as a financial analyst at Armitage Global, a Fortune 500 company with offices in Lower Manhattan, just steps from Wall Street. My days were full of numbers, forecasts, board meetings, and late nights spent making sure every decimal lined up. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something most people in this city crave: stability. The perks weren't bad either. Corporate dinners at Delmonico's, power lunches near Broadway, client events in ballrooms at the Plaza Hotel. Colleagues respected me, trusted me. In the financial world, your reputation is everything, and mine was solid. Or so I thought. At home, my life seemed just as steady. Melissa Ross, 36, my wife, my partner, and my department head. We met years ago at the firm, and what started as a spark over late-night spreadsheets turned into a marriage that everyone in the office envied. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Behind closed doors, it was more complicated. At home, Melissa was warm, loving, attentive. At work, she was cold, sharp, always pushing, always testing. She could praise me over dinner for my loyalty and then tear apart my reports in the morning in front of the entire team. I told myself it was just roles we had to play: husband and wife at home, boss and subordinate under the fluorescent lights. I convinced myself we could keep those worlds separate. That was my first mistake. New York has a way of humbling you. One day you're climbing the steps of Federal Hall with a coffee in your hand, feeling like you belong in this city of power and ambition. The next, the ground disappears beneath you. The day she fired me is burned into my memory. It was a Tuesday, gray skies hanging over Manhattan, the kind of day when the clouds feel heavy enough to crush the skyline. I was sitting in the glass conference room, colleagues scattered around the long, polished table, half of them still clutching their Starbucks cups. Melissa stood at the head of the table, poised, elegant in her ivory suit, eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice calm, steady, rehearsed. "Daniel Ross is no longer with the company." That was it. No warning, no conversation, just the end of 20 years, spoken in one breath. I remember the silence that followed. No one met my eyes. A few pretended to scroll through their phones. Others just stared at the floor. In New York corporate culture, loyalty only lasts as long as your paycheck does. And just like that, I was out. It felt like free fall, but what I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. Melissa's betrayal went far beyond marriage vows or office politics. She wasn't just taking away my job. She was building something else in the shadows, something that would shake the foundations of the company itself. She thought she had ended me, but the truth? She had just lit the match that would burn her entire empire down. If you've ever tried working with your spouse, you probably know it can test every part of your patience. Now imagine your wife isn't just your colleague, she's your boss. She holds your career in her hands, while you try to hold a marriage together in the same 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side. That was my life. At home, Melissa could be tender. She made coffee exactly the way I liked it, strong, with just a touch of milk. On Sundays, she would curl up beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, humming along to old Sinatra records while I read the paper. She'd laugh at my corny jokes, slip her hand into mine, and for a few hours I'd believe she was the same woman I'd fallen for years ago. But when Monday morning came and the elevators opened on the 32nd floor of Armitage Global, everything changed. Melissa wasn't my wife anymore. She was the head of the financial department, the iron hand of the company, and she wielded her authority like a blade. She inspected my reports line by line, circling the smallest errors in red ink, as if she were a schoolteacher scolding a child. In meetings, she cut me off mid-sentence, asking Jason Miller, her so-called right-hand man, to double-check Daniel's numbers, just in case. She'd roll her eyes, sigh dramatically, and make sure the entire room saw her disappointment. There was one morning I'll never forget. We were reviewing a client forecast for a hedge fund out of Midtown. The numbers were solid. I triple-checked them. But Melissa wanted blood. She flipped through the pages, slammed them shut, and looked at me across the table. "Sloppy," she said flatly. Then, to the entire team, "This is why we fall behind. Because some people don't understand accuracy is everything." Her eyes didn't leave mine. Jason smirked, and 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me like I was some rookie who didn't belong there. I wanted to sink into the floor. That's the thing about humiliation. It's not the words themselves. It's the way they echo. In the quiet of the office afterward, in the glances your co-workers give you at the water cooler, in the whisper you catch as you walk past. Melissa had carved me down in front of everyone, and they saw me differently after that. I wasn't Daniel Ross, the reliable analyst. I was Daniel Ross, the man who couldn't meet his boss's standards. And then I'd go home. Same woman, different mask. She'd greet me at the door with a smile, a glass of wine in her hand, asking about my day as if she hadn't torn me apart hours earlier. Sometimes she'd cook pasta with her favorite sauce, set the table with candles, tell me she loved me. She'd say it softly, like she meant it. And for a while, I let myself believe she did. But even then, late at night, lying beside her in bed, I felt the shift. The warmth was still there, but it was thinner, stretched. Like a painting that had been touched up too many times. You could still see the colors, but the cracks were showing underneath. Looking back, I think that was the start of it. That split between Melissa at home and Melissa at work. I kept telling myself it was just the pressure of the job, the way she needed to project strength in front of the board, the way women in power had to fight harder in this city. I defended her, even to myself. But deep down, a thought started to creep in. What if the cruelty wasn't an act? What if the woman I thought I loved wasn't there anymore, and this other version, the ruthless, cold, calculating one, was the real Melissa? At the time, I shoved the thought aside. I told myself all marriages had phases, that the stress of corporate life would pass. I clung to the Sundays, the Sinatra, the wine at dinner, as if those fragments could hold back the tide. But New York doesn't forgive blind spots. And mine was about to cost me more than I could imagine. Because while I was busy convincing myself everything was fine, Melissa was already planning her next move. It's funny how betrayal doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeps in quietly, like a draft through a cracked window. At first, you barely notice it. A chill at the back of your neck, a flicker in the air, until one day you realize the whole house is freezing. That's how it started with Melissa. At home, her warmth began to thin out. The Sunday Sinatra records grew quieter, the casual laughter less frequent. She still smiled, but it was slower, rehearsed. Her phone was suddenly in her hand more than it was on the nightstand, and she guarded it like it contained nuclear codes. At first, I convinced myself it was stress. Our department was juggling a couple of big accounts, hedge funds with impossible expectations, clients who lived and breathed numbers like they were scripture. Melissa had always carried that weight harder than most. But this time, it felt different. She started taking calls late at night, in the hallway, her voice lowered to a whisper. "Work," she'd say, sliding back into bed after midnight, smelling faintly of perfume she hadn't been wearing earlier in the evening. Melissa never used to bring work home. She prided herself on leaving the office at the office. Now, the office was following her everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The excuses piled up. Emergency meeting, client dinner, unexpected overtime. Nights when she used to be curled up beside me with a glass of Cabernet, she was gone. Nights when she promised she'd be home by 9, she stumbled in after 11, claiming the subway had been delayed. I checked the MTA schedule once. There were no delays that night. And at the office, the storm only worsened. Her criticism of me became sharper, more personal. Every report I submitted was sloppy. Every forecast needed revisions. She asked Jason Miller to review my numbers more often, and I caught the way his eyes lingered on her in meetings, sharp, calculating, hungry. And maybe it was my imagination, but her eyes lingered back. One evening I walked past her office after hours. The glass walls gave me a perfect view. Melissa and Jason standing close, too close, their heads bent together over a laptop. She laughed at something he whispered, a laugh I hadn't heard at home in months. When she noticed me in the hallway, her smile snapped off like a light bulb blown out. She waved me away, said it was just numbers. But I'd been in finance long enough to know when numbers didn't add up. And in my marriage, they weren't adding up at all. The shift was subtle, but it cut deep. Melissa no longer asked about my day, no longer cared if I came home late. She started canceling our dinners with friends, claiming exhaustion, though I'd see the glow of her phone lighting up her face for hours. The woman who once curled into me like I was her anchor now felt like she was drifting, untethered, caught in a current I couldn't follow. The first real fracture came one Thursday evening. She announced she had to stay late for a strategic planning session. I knew the workload. I was part of it. There was no strategic session scheduled. I sat awake that night, watching the city lights flicker through our bedroom window, waiting for her key to turn in the lock. When she finally came home, well past midnight, she smelled faintly of champagne. She claimed she'd been networking. I didn't say a word. Not then. I just watched her slip off her heels, watched her avoid my eyes as she slid into bed, and I felt something inside me harden. Suspicion isn't an explosion. It's erosion. It wears away at you, one unanswered text, one unexplained smile, one lie told too casually. And by then, I was already eroding. Still, part of me held on. I told myself I was imagining it, that Melissa was too ambitious, too smart to risk everything we'd built. But another part, the part that had survived years in the cutthroat world of Wall Street, knew better. Something was coming. I could feel it. And soon enough, I wouldn't have to imagine anymore. I would see it with my own eyes. Every December, Armitage Global hosted its annual holiday gala, a night of tuxedos, champagne, and the kind of carefully staged laughter that fills a room when everyone knows they're being watched. This year, it was at Delmonico's, that legendary Wall Street institution where steaks are served like jewels and the mahogany walls hum with a century of secrets. For most employees, it was a reward. For me, it felt like a test. Melissa insisted we attend together, the picture-perfect corporate couple. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like it had been stitched for that room alone. Heads turned when we walked in. She thrived on that kind of attention. I tried to smile, to play the part. But somewhere inside, the knot of suspicion I'd been carrying tightened until I could hardly breathe. The night was a blur of handshakes and clinking glasses. Waiters floated by with trays of oysters and champagne flutes. Conversations about year-end bonuses and market forecasts buzzed beneath the golden chandeliers. And then there was Jason Miller, Melissa's so-called right-hand man. Hovering near her all evening like a shadow, she didn't want to shake. At first, I tried to ignore it. The subtle brush of his hand against hers as they reached for the same glass. The way she tilted her head back when he whispered something, laughing too easily, too brightly. But soon this subtle turned into spectacle. I saw her touch his arm, lightly at first, then with a familiarity that froze me in place. I saw Jason lean in close, his lips grazing her ear as if the whole room didn't exist. And worst of all, I saw her smile, not the polite, professional one she wore for clients, but the smile she used to give me. It was the kind of betrayal you don't need words for. It played out right there, under the chandeliers of Delmonico's, in front of colleagues who pretended not to see but absolutely saw everything. I caught their sidelong glances, the whispers behind champagne flutes, the careful way no one mentioned it out loud. That's how corporate New York works. They watch, they gossip, but they never interfere. Everyone protects their own position. And me? I stood there with a drink sweating in my hand, feeling like the floor had opened beneath me while the orchestra kept playing. At one point, Melissa and Jason disappeared onto the balcony overlooking Beaver Street. I followed, not close enough to interrupt, but enough to see her hand resting on his shoulder, his leaning just a little too far in. My chest tightened. I wasn't just an analyst anymore. I was a witness. When she came back inside, she acted as if nothing had happened. She handed me a fresh glass of wine, kissed my cheek lightly, a performance for the crowd. And the cruelest part? Everyone clapped along. They saw her as the powerful executive with the devoted husband by her side. They didn't see the knife sliding between my ribs. That night, when we finally left Delmonico's, the streets of Lower Manhattan were slick with winter rain. Taxis hissed past, their lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Melissa held my arm, smiling at colleagues as we said our goodbyes, as if she hadn't just set the rumor mill on fire. In the cab ride home, she was silent, scrolling through her phone, the glow of the screen lighting her face. I stared out the window, the city rushing by, and I realized something I hadn't admitted until then. Suspicions are one thing, but once you've seen it with your own eyes, there's no going back. That night was the first real fracture. And fractures, if you don't repair them, only grow deeper. After the Delmonico's party, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just me who'd seen Melissa and Jason's little performance. Everyone had. The problem was, in New York corporate culture, seeing doesn't mean speaking. It means whispering in corners, sharing half-smiles over coffee breaks, but never daring to acknowledge the truth out loud. The next Monday, when I walked into the office on Wall Street, I felt it instantly. The stares that lingered half a second too long, the sudden hush of conversations when I entered the break room. Nobody said a word to me about what they'd witnessed, but the silence was louder than any accusation. I tried to break through it, to find one friendly face, one colleague who'd admit what we both knew. At lunch, I sat down across from a coworker I'd known for nearly a decade. A guy who once came to my house for Thanksgiving when his family couldn't make it into the city. I asked him straight, "Did you notice anything at the gala?" He froze, his fork hovering over his salad, then muttered something about not wanting to get involved. And just like that, he got up and left. The same pattern repeated everywhere. People I'd worked late nights with, people I'd covered for when they missed deadlines, suddenly looked right through me. Some even avoided eye contact completely. Melissa wasn't just my wife, she was their boss. And nobody in their right mind risks their paycheck for a man being slowly erased. It was humiliating, in its own quiet way. I wasn't just fighting a battle against Melissa and Jason anymore. I was fighting the weight of silence, the collective decision of an entire floor of employees to pretend they didn't see. It made me feel like a ghost in my own office, present, but untouchable, as though I no longer belonged to the living world of corporate ambition. Jason, of course, thrived in the new dynamic. He became bolder, louder in meetings. He'd cut across my presentations with unnecessary corrections, small but sharp, while Melissa nodded approvingly. Once, when I misread a data point, a single digit in a 20-page report, Jason laughed under his breath, just loud enough for the others to hear. Melissa didn't scold him. She smirked. It was clear they'd already chosen sides. And the side wasn't mine. At night, when I came home, the contrast cut even deeper. Melissa tried to maintain the mask, dinner on the table, a kiss on the cheek, the same soft voice asking about my day. But I could see it now, the cracks in the act. Her eyes flicked to her phone more often than they met mine. Her laughter was too sharp, her tenderness too practiced. I wanted to confront her. God, I wanted to ask the question that burned at the back of my throat every time she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. But here's the thing. Betrayal has a way of paralyzing you. It's not just about anger or heartbreak. It's about fear. Fear of what happens when you finally say it out loud and the lie can't be taken back. So I stayed quiet, just like my colleagues. And in that silence, Melissa gained more power. Looking back, I realized I was already being pushed out. Not officially, not yet. But socially, emotionally, I'd already been cut from the herd. I was the man no one wanted to sit beside. the coworker whose presence made people glance nervously toward the boss's office. I told myself I still had time to fix things, to figure out what was happening. But the truth? The boardroom games were already being played above my head, and I was just a pawn left standing on the wrong side of the board. The whispers were growing, and soon enough, they'd turn into action. Every betrayal has a trigger point. For me, it came on a Thursday morning, inside a glass-walled conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and fresh printouts. Melissa had been circling me for weeks, like a hawk waiting for the exact moment her prey stumbled. And I stumbled, not because of incompetence, but because she wanted me to. The project was a forecast for one of our largest clients, a hedge fund operating out of Midtown. The market had turned volatile overnight. Oil prices collapsed after a surprise OPEC announcement. The kind of black swan event no analyst could have predicted. My numbers reflected the reality of the crash. Losses, downward trends, the kind of uncomfortable truth clients don't like to hear. Jason, of course, had a different version ready. A rosier, adjusted forecast that conveniently ignored half the indicators. His report was optimistic, borderline fantasy, exactly what Melissa wanted to present to the board. When the time came to deliver, she made her move. "Mr. Ross," she said formally, her voice echoing off the glass. "Can you explain why your projections are so drastically different from Mr. Miller's?" I explained, calmly, methodically. I laid out the market data, the OPEC announcement, the ripple effect across sectors. It was textbook analysis, the kind of work I'd built my reputation on for years. But Melissa didn't want truth. She wanted a scapegoat. She leaned back in her chair, fingers laced, her crimson lipstick catching the light. "So what you're saying is, you failed to anticipate market turbulence, and as a result, your forecast is unreliable." "No," I said firmly. "What I'm saying is the turbulence is the forecast. Pretending otherwise is dangerous." The room went silent. Jason tilted his head, feigning sympathy, as if I were a student fumbling through a test. And then Melissa delivered the blow. "Unacceptable," she said flatly. "This level of negligence puts our client relationships at risk. As department head, I cannot overlook such professional incompetence." Incompetence. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The irony? My analysis was the only one rooted in reality. But reality doesn't win in corporate New York. Power does. And Melissa wielded hers like a knife. By the end of that day, I was summoned to HR. A polished woman with a practiced frown slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a termination notice citing failure to meet performance standards. No discussion, no appeal, just a polite escort to the elevator bank, as if 20 years of service could be boxed up and carried out in a single afternoon. I walked out of Armitage Global with a cardboard box in my hands. A framed photo of Melissa and me from a company retreat in the Hamptons. A paperweight my team gave me on my 10-year anniversary. A mug with the faded logo of a client long since bankrupt. That was all I was allowed to keep. Melissa didn't look at me as security walked me past her office. Jason stood in the doorway beside her, his lips curved in a smile so faint it was almost invisible. Almost. And that's when it hit me. This hadn't been an impulsive decision. It was orchestrated. My firing wasn't about numbers or forecasts. It was about clearing the board, removing me from both her personal life and her professional one. She thought she had ended the game, but she had underestimated me. Because when you take everything from a man, his career, his reputation, his marriage, you leave him with nothing to lose. And nothing to lose is far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Losing a job in New York feels like being erased. One day you're part of the pulse, riding the subway in your pressed suit, grabbing coffee from the cart on Broadway, nodding at the doorman who knows your name. The next, you're just another man wandering the streets, invisible, your ID badge already deactivated. I spent the first week in shock, drifting through the city like a ghost. I sat in coffee shops on Stone Street, watching men in tailored suits walk by, wondering if they even knew how fragile their world was, wondering if Melissa had already replaced my chair with Jason's. But grief turns into anger, and anger turns into resolve. And the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. Melissa hadn't fired me because of a forecast. She'd been planning this for months, maybe years. And if she thought I was going to slink away quietly, she hadn't married the man she thought she did. So I started digging. I went back over old files I'd saved on an external drive, reports Melissa had signed off on, expense sheets, budget approvals. At first, it looked ordinary, but then patterns began to emerge. Bonuses approved for Jason, disproportionate to his role. Travel expenses filed under client development that didn't match any actual meetings I knew about. Late-night dinners at high-end restaurants like Le Bernardin charged to the company, with no clients listed. It wasn't just favoritism. It was something more. I reached out quietly to a couple of former colleagues who had left Armitage. Over beers at a dimly lit bar in Tribeca, one of them lowered his voice and told me what I already suspected. Daniel, she was setting you up. People knew. She'd been looking for a reason to cut you loose for months. He glanced over his shoulder before adding. And Jason, well, let's just say everyone's seen how close they are. The words burned, but they also sharpened me. This wasn't paranoia. This was fact. At home, things were worse. Melissa barely acknowledged me anymore, except for the occasional performance of civility, a half-hearted dinner, a forced smile. When I finally confronted her, asking outright if Jason had replaced me in more ways than one, she laughed. Actually laughed. Daniel, you're paranoid, she said, sipping her wine like it was a comedy. You've always overthought everything. The gaslighting stung almost more than the betrayal itself. But I didn't push. Not yet. Instead, I smiled back, nodded, pretended to accept her words. Because if Melissa thought I was broken, she'd lower her guard. And the truth was, I was just getting started. I spent my nights piecing together the puzzle. Old emails, archived reports, whispers from people too nervous to say more. Slowly, a picture began to form. Melissa hadn't just wanted me out of the way. She wanted me out of the company, out of her life, out of her empire. And Jason Miller? He was sitting at my desk now. Literally. My nameplate had been scraped off, his placed on top. The same office, the same view of the Hudson, but now with his smirk reflected in the glass. The betrayal was no longer just marital. It was professional. It was financial. It was surgical. And if there's one thing years in finance teach you, it's how to follow the money. Melissa thought she'd silenced me, but all she'd really done was hand me a reason to dig deeper. And what I was about to find, it would turn suspicion into proof. Numbers don't lie. That's the first lesson you learn in finance, and the last one you forget. People lie. People cheat. But numbers, they always leave a trail. And that trail was about to lead me straight into the heart of Melissa's empire. I started by combing through old quarterly reports, the ones Melissa had insisted only she and Jason review before submitting them to the board. I'd saved copies, tucked away like breadcrumbs in case I ever needed them. And now, staring at them under the weak light of my apartment desk lamp, I saw what I'd been too blind to see before. There were client development expenses filed on nights when I knew Melissa wasn't with clients. I checked the receipts. Le Bernardin, Nobu downtown, private lounges in Midtown where the bill for a single evening climbed into 5 figures. On paper, it looked like client entertainment. But the clients listed didn't exist. They were fictions, placeholders. And Melissa's signature was on every approval line. Then came the bonuses. Jason Miller, a mid-level manager with average credentials, had received payouts larger than some senior VPs. Year after year, Melissa had signed off on his windfalls, justifying them with exceptional performance. But I knew Jason's work. I'd corrected his spreadsheets more times than I could count. His performance wasn't exceptional, unless you counted exceptional loyalty to Melissa. I dug deeper, cross-referencing transfers, tracing transactions through shell accounts buried in the company's ledgers. It was there, in black and white. Melissa had authorized payouts to entities tied to Jason, consulting fees, subcontracting costs, even training seminars that never happened. Money was being siphoned out of Armitage Global and funneled directly into her lover's pockets. And she thought no one would ever notice. The weight of it hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just about betrayal and marriage. It wasn't even about her humiliating me at work. Melissa was committing fraud, the kind that could sink a department, the kind that could bring down an entire career if exposed. I remember staring at one particular document, a six-figure transfer signed under Melissa's hand. The justification nothing but a vague line about strategic development. My stomach turned. I'd seen that phrase before. On the night she told me she had a strategic planning session that kept her out past midnight. She hadn't just lied to me. She'd lied to everyone. That night, I sat in my apartment, the city's glow spilling through the window, papers spread across the table like a crime scene. Outside, New York moved on, taxis honking on Broadway, the hum of life never slowing. Inside, I realized my life with Melissa was already over. What remained was something bigger. The affair was one thing, but this was corporate treason. And if Armitage Global's board ever saw what I had, Melissa wouldn't just lose me. She'd lose everything. For the first time since the day she fired me, I felt something strange, not despair, not humiliation, but power. Real power. Because now the truth wasn't a suspicion. It wasn't a whisper. It was evidence. Melissa thought she'd cut me out cleanly, like trimming fat from a report. But she'd forgotten who I was. I was an analyst. My job was to find patterns, to trace numbers, to expose risk. And she was about to discover just how good I really was at my job. Revenge, I've learned, isn't about anger. It's about precision. If you strike too soon, it looks like desperation. If you strike too late, the damage is already done. The key is timing. And I had the timing and the evidence on my side. The question was, how do you bring down a woman like Melissa Ross? A department head at one of the largest firms in New York, a woman who had spent years cultivating loyalty, fear, and the perfect image. If I stormed into the company with accusations, they'd laugh me out of the building. The bitter ex-husband, the man she fired for incompetence. But if I wanted to win, I couldn't look like a bitter man. I had to look like the truth. So I called the one man who'd always believed in my work. Richard Campbell, Armitage's former chief financial officer. He was retired now, living upstate, but I knew he still had pull with the board. I drove out to see him one gray afternoon, my briefcase heavy with documents. We sat in his study, a fire burning low in the hearth. I spread the files across his oak desk. The fake expenses, the inflated bonuses, the shell accounts. Richard leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose as he scanned the pages. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he looked up at me. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this isn't favoritism. This is fraud." I nodded. "And it's all signed under Melissa's name." His jaw tightened. He'd always respected Melissa's ambition, but respect only goes so far when numbers tell a different story. After a long silence, he reached for the phone. "I can get you in front of the board. But you understand, once you walk into that room, there's no coming back." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. A week later, I was in the 43rd floor boardroom of Armitage Global, the skyline stretching wide behind me. The directors sat around a polished mahogany table, their faces impassive, their suits impeccable. Melissa was at the head, Jason seated smugly at her side. She didn't expect me. When I walked in with Richard, her smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to see it. Richard cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, ladies, we need to hear Mr. Ross's findings." I laid the files on the table. My voice was steady, my heart a drum in my chest. Page by page, I walked them through the fraud. The falsified expenses, the inflated bonuses, the shell accounts funneling money to Jason. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just presented the numbers that didn't lie. The silence in that room was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. The board members flipped through the evidence, their brows furrowing, their eyes darting toward Melissa. Jason shifted in his chair, his smirk fading as he realized the walls were closing in. Melissa tried to speak. This is a personal vendetta. He's bitter, he's twisting data." But I cut her off, calmly, firmly. "Every document here has your signature. Every approval line traces back to you. These aren't my numbers, Melissa. They're yours. The weight of the room turned against her. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, fear. She had thought she destroyed me by firing me. But in that boardroom, on that morning in Lower Manhattan, it became clear who was truly cornered. And I wasn't finished yet. Boardrooms are designed to intimidate. The glass walls, the view over Lower Manhattan, the cold polish of mahogany tables. They make you feel small, no matter who you are. But that morning, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, like I'd been carrying a weight for months, and finally, I was putting it down. The directors didn't take long. They never do when money is involved. Fraud isn't just a personal failing. It's a cancer in a company like Armitage Global, and once you see it, you cut it out before it spreads. Melissa argued, denied, even tried to turn it back on me. But the more she talked, the more tangled she became. Jason tried too, stammering excuses, claiming he had no idea where the bonuses came from. But the signatures told the story. The trail of numbers was undeniable. When the decision was made, it was swift. Melissa Ross was removed from her position, effective immediately. Jason Miller, terminated. Security was called. I sat there, watching as the two of them, once so smug, so untouchable, were escorted out of the very building they had thought they controlled. I won't lie, there was satisfaction in that moment. To see Jason's smirk dissolve, to see Melissa's poise crack under the weight of truth. But the satisfaction wasn't triumph. It was survival. Because what they'd tried to take from me wasn't just a job. It was dignity. After the meeting, Richard put a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Daniel," he said quietly. I nodded, though the truth is, the right thing doesn't always feel good. Walking out of that boardroom, I knew my marriage was ashes. My career at Armitage was finished, and the life I thought I had, the home, the love, the future, had been an illusion for longer than I wanted to admit. But here's the thing about illusions. Once they're gone, you can finally see clearly. Melissa thought she destroyed me the day she fired me. She thought stripping me of a title, a salary, a place in the company would erase who I was. But in the end, she destroyed herself. Her reputation, her career, her carefully crafted image, gone. Jason was just collateral damage. And me? I walked away with something they never expected. The truth. My name cleared. My head high. New York is a brutal city. It chews people up and spits them out every single day. But it also rewards those who endure. And as I stood on Wall Street that afternoon, watching the traffic surge past, I realized endurance was my victory. I lost a wife. I lost a job. But I kept something more important, myself. And sometimes, that's the only revenge that matters.